John Kane, I first really got to know when he was Oliver in high school. And maybe that singing career was part of his comfort, speaking with people, speaking up in front of people. He certainly was good at belting it out. I don't know, do you still sing?
Not much.
No. And while we knew in high school that John was an Indian, that's what we still said back then, we never really thought about how it would make someone of an indigenous family heritage feel to be playing on a team called the Indians, which was all white kids and putting on war paint and running around and winning soccer games. But I think you can imagine over the past 50 years, the many issues we've started to think about more deeply. And so it was very, it was moving to me to see John and others start to try to get our old high school to change its name from the Indians to pick something else. The Seagulls, I don't care. But when you are loyal to your teams and you're loyal to your high school and someone wants to change, this causes a lot of emotional upheaval. And so we kind of went through a period of suddenly we're arguing with the same people we went to high school with and we're in musicals with. John's work as an activist and as a voice for Native peoples, not just his own people, the Mohawk, but many First Peoples from around the country, has shown how much those little parts of us from high school or from college, from the early years, can grow over the years and gain this tremendous power and the ability to start changing the world. He lives now in Eastern New York.
Western Europe.
Oh, he grew up in Eastern New York, and now he's in Western New York, right? But we're in Eastern New York, so I'm obviously confused. I'm probably not going to say this right, the Cattaraugus.
That's really good.
Close enough for me, anyway. All right, Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. He's been involved for most of his adult life in Native issues, specifically defending Native sovereignty and autonomy. He's taken on taxation and regulatory battles at the state and national level, and continues to work at the state and federal levels to this day. He also takes on social and environmental issues, such as Native mascots, murdered and missing indigenous women, land use issues, land claims, the pipeline, Dakota Access Pipeline, for instance. Oh, and Columbus. Happy Columbus Day. John is a radio show host and a podcaster. His radio show, Resistance Radio, is carried by WBAI 99.5 FM in New York City. I can occasionally get that when I'm on a drive south. And WPFW 89.3 in Washington, D.C. His podcast can be heard on all the major podcast platforms. And you just search Let's Talk Native with John Kane podcast, and boom, something will take you there, and you can hear more of his work. Videos of his shows are also streamed on Facebook on his Let's Talk Native with John Kane group page, and on his Let's Talk Native TV YouTube channel, which we're going to watch a little bit of today, along with a library of short-form videos produced by his crew in the Cattaraugus studio. He has a strong voice on Native issues, and it has made him a go-to pundit for Native issues when they need someone to speak to the conflict, speak to the issue, speak to the breaking news item. He's spoken on that Native mascot issue, on gaming law, language, culture, politics. He's been invited to speak at many universities from Arizona to Long Island, as well as at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the United Nations. He's here to talk with us today. We're not as big as the United Nations, but I know you will have good questions, and welcome warmly our guest, John Kane.
Well, I want to thank Nancy for inviting me, first off, and we did go to school together. We were pretty good friends. We did theater together and that kind of thing. So I'm not surprised to see where Nancy is, and I'm not sure how much of a surprise it is for my old classmates to see where I'm at. As Nancy said, I am Native. I am Mohawk, but more accurately, Gunyagahaga, which is our word for. We're called Mohawks. That's not even our word, but and that's part of the issue. I mean, if you look at Mohawk, you're going to get a haircut that's going to show up on the search engines. But I'm Gunyagahaga. My wife is Onyotaaga, which is otherwise known as Oneida, and we live on the territory of the Seneca Nation, or Onondaga. I live in the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. I've got 3 kids, 9 grandchildren, and I do speak on Native issues. And frankly, I try to keep it light most of the time, but when you're talking about such contentious issues, it can get contentious. And I know that one of the questions that Nancy had forwarded to me suggested about how to address these issues. And tone policing is something that Native people are really hit with oftentimes. Are we coming across as too angry when we're addressing some of the things we don't agree with, and that's a challenge. So hopefully, if I come across as too angry, any of you, just don't take it too seriously. These are serious issues, but there's a level of absurdity with some of this stuff that really can be laughable. And so even as I do my shows, whether it's on radio or it's my podcast, believe it or not, as serious as these issues are, there's some joking and some humor involved. And I hope after this event, I'm going to meet up with a bunch of the social justice group from our hometown, Cambridge, because that fight over the mascot issue has been really kind of intense. And I think they need to laugh a little bit. And I'm hoping that when we actually sit down, not just on social media, but face to face for probably the first time, we'll be able to kind of enjoy company a little bit. When Nancy first asked me to speak to you, she mentioned Columbus Day, Indigenous Peoples Day, this being the week before that is commemorated, if not celebrated, I don't know. So I figured I'd start there, and I figure European contact is a good place to start with any of this. So I thought the best way to start is, I do have a short video, it's a 9-minute video that I did on Columbus in his own words and the words of his contemporaries. So rather than me repeating everything I essentially said in the video, I figured why not just show the video, and then you'll know to look for that. It's my video channel is Let's Talk Native TV, but if you just search Columbus in his own words, my video, it came up first thing when we searched it. So why don't we start there, and then we'll go on from there.
Okay. Before you get your yoga,
And spears and many other things. They willingly traded us everything they owned. They were well built, with good bodies and handsome features. They did not bear arms, and they did not know them. For I showed them a sword, and they took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They had no iron. Their spears were made of cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. These are the words of Christopher Columbus, written by his own hand about the people he encountered as a result of his famed voyages. Not the words of a brave hero or righteous explorer, but a merciless marauding tyrant. Rather than continuing the myths, the lies, and embellishments of this man, let's let his own words and the words of his contemporaries tell the real story. We will quote Columbus, cite historical accounts, and offer the observations of a bishop serving in the settlements established by Columbus. The expedition of Columbus was a failure. He did not reach the eastern regions of Asia. He did not chart a new maritime route for trade to the East Indies. Oh yeah. And the people he encountered on the islands he ran into were not Indians. He miscalculated the size of the planet by almost half. And it would be later European navigators who would establish that the land Columbus came upon was not actually Asia, but rather a vast, populated world of islands and continents previously unknown to Europe. This failure had consequences, as did Columbus's reports back to the Spanish crown of an abundance of natives for slaves, rivers of gold, and a land of riches. There was actually very little gold and other riches that could be delivered to Spain for sponsoring Columbus's voyages, and certainly no access to trade with the East. Out of desperation, Columbus relied completely on slavery to justify his settlements and voyages. Indeed, these peaceful, generous people were subjugated and enslaved, and the cruelty is well documented. In Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, Zinn cites the journals of Columbus and others under his command, and the writings of Bartolome de las Casas, a former slave owner who became a priest and the bishop of Chiapas. Las Casas wrote, "Such inhumanities and barbarism were committed in my sight as no ages can parallel. My eyes have seen these acts so foreign to human nature that I now tremble as I write." Columbus was greeted by the Arawak. They offered help to the voyagers, including food and hospitality. They farmed corn, yams, cassava, and cotton. They wove fabric, but had no work animals or large land mammals for game. They had no iron, but some wore jewelry, including small amounts of gold. This would have devastating consequences. Las Casas wrote endless testimonies proved the mild and pacific temperament of the natives. But our work was to exasperate, ravage, kill, mangle, and destroy. The admiral, it is true, was blind as those that came after him, and was so anxious to please the king that he committed irreparable crimes against the Indians. Native people were enslaved for service in their own homeland, and others were shipped back to Spain. Thousands were gathered for the first transatlantic slave trade. Hundreds would die on each of these journeys, while millions would die enslaved on their own lands. Las Casas documented these conditions. He wrote of native people forced to work in gold mines to complete exhaustion and death. Those who opposed were beheaded or brutally disfigured. He wrote, they suffered and died in the mines and other labors in desperate silence, knowing not a soul in the world to whom they could run for help. In some provinces, all persons over the age of 14 had to fill a thimble with gold dust every 3 months. They would have copper shackles bound to their necks as proof of compliance. Those who could not fulfill this obligation would have their hands cut off and strung around their necks while they bled to death. Over 10,000 died handless. But slavery was not limited to gold production. The rape culture of Europe had an immediate effect. One of Columbus's captains wrote, I captured a beautiful woman whom the Lord Admiral gave to me. And having taken her into my cabin, I conceived desire to take pleasure. But she did not want it, and treated me with her fingernails in such a manner that I wished I had never begun. But seeing that, I took a rope, and I thrashed her well. She raised such unheard of screams that you would not have believed your ears. Finally, we came to an agreement in such a manner that I can tell you that she seemed to have been brought up in a school of harlots. Sex slaves were not just a means to compensate his crew. Columbus shipped young girls back to Spain as well. Columbus wrote, 100 castellanos are easily obtained for a woman, and there are plenty of dealers who go about looking for girls. Those from 9 to 10 are now in demand. Las Casas tells how the conceit of the Spaniards grew every day. Total control led to unimaginable cruelty and exploitation. Some refused to walk, forcing Native people to carry them on their backs or in hammocks. Las Casas wrote, Native Indians carry large leaves to shade them from the sun, and others to fan them with goose wings. The Spaniards, Las Casas wrote, thought nothing of knifing Indians by the 10s or 20s, and of cutting slices off them to test the sharpness of their blades. Columbus and the Spaniards brought war dogs to the Caribbean as weapons against the natives. In the early years of Columbus's reign, there were butcher shops throughout the islands where Indian bodies were sold as dog food. Live babies were fed to the war dogs for sport and for entertainment, sometimes in front of their horrified parents. In 2 years' time, approximately 250,000 Indians were dead on Haiti. Many of these deaths included mass suicides or mothers killing their babies to avoid the horrors of a life and death of persecution. Bartolome de las Casas wrote, when he arrived in Hispaniola in 1508, there were 60,000 people living on the island, including the Indians. So that from 1494 to 1508, over 3 million people had perished from war, slavery, and the mines. He asked, who in future generations will believe this? I myself, writing as a knowledgeable eyewitness, can hardly believe it. Today, most Americans reject the truth of Columbus. They prefer the fairy tale version, the discovered America version. Italian Americans prop him up as their patron saint, falsely associating him with their own Italian heritage. His name is celebrated with holidays, in parades, as a name for cities, towns, and regions, including a province in Canada, the U.S. capital, and a country of South America. So what of Las Casas' question? Who in future generations will believe this? Will the truth prevail? Or will the myth of a fabricated hero continue?
The message is clear. And the final note is that the truth
Is he with us?
is a weapon. And it should be used. It should be used not just to beat or conquer, but to educate. And I'm not here necessarily to teach you guys anything. I'm here to encourage you to learn and encourage you to teach. Because whether you write or whether you do produce audio-visual material, the whole goal is that people will learn from the work that you do, whether it's fiction, whether it's documentary work, whatever the case may be. So I'm hoping to perhaps provide you with a different perspective, because obviously perspective is oftentimes shaped and propagandized for a specific purpose. The whole reason that the myth of Columbus is told the way it is was an objective. Italian immigrants were trying to assert themselves as meaningful and a positive contribution to American society. The Catholic Church was also trying to promote itself in the United States, especially since it was primarily Protestant controlled. So there was agendas tied to promoting Columbus in the way that he was the way he's been promoted. And yes, you can buy cheap mattresses next week, and by all means do so. But the whole idea that Columbus is or was a hero, I mean, the fact of the matter is, Christopher Columbus never stepped foot on a single portion of land that the United States claims as its territory. And so much of it is a myth. And it's amazing that something like this can grab a hold. And I come back to the word Indians. there's a myth that goes around that says the word Indians was not tied to India, and while it may not have been tied to a country called India, there was no question, as per Columbus's journals, he was attempting to reach Indonesia, what the Europeans were calling India, not necessarily the country of India, but the Indies. They called them the East Indies. In fact, once the islands of the Caribbean were discovered, they actually referred to those as the West Indies. And rather than correcting the mistake, they just, well, we'll just keep the name and we'll just change the direction. So part of the reason that somebody like myself does not necessarily like the word Indian is because it's not only a misnomer, it's a mistake. It's a mistake created by somebody whose legacy is not one that is favorable from a Native perspective. So I know a lot of Native people embrace the word and have taken ownership of it, and I understand that. I am not among those. I still would rather, I'd use the word Native as just a benign way of addressing who we are. If I'm amongst Native people, I'll use a word, our word is Ongwe, and it actually means original or real human being. And that real is also, realness is associated with our connection to the land. So the words are usually deeper and they have more description to them if you delve into it. But we live in a society now that labels are usually pretty superficial, and most people don't delve into where what the word meaning actually is, just what we've come to know it to mean, and sometimes that robs us a little bit. So Christopher Columbus, beyond what took place in the Caribbean and would spread across primarily South America, he was the originator to the slave trade. The first transatlantic slaves were not Africans being brought to the Western Hemisphere. It was actually Native people being brought back to Europe. As I said, in some cases sex slaves, young girls. But that's where the beginning of the slave trade starts. But it actually is the beginning of a genocide that I would argue still is being perpetrated against Native people today. It's changed. The strategies associated with it has changed, and I'll talk a little bit about that. It also, Columbus's voyage also reaffirmed what we now call the doctrine of Christian discovery. This was basically church dogma that came out of the Vatican that essentially not just gave permission, but actually encouraged the seizing of land, the enslavement of pagans, and the taking of any property, freedom, property, land, and the lives of people who were not Christians. So this was an entitlement to the Christian nations of Europe to essentially spread Christendom, throughout the globe. That's what was encouraged as a result of Columbus's voyage. And that would not just be church dogma, it would actually become codified in U.S. law. In 1823, the U.S. Supreme Court, under Justice John Marshall, would literally codify this doctrine of Christian discovery into U.S. law. And it solved a huge problem for the United States. It solved this idea of how they can claim land title. And by just claiming the Christian nations of Europe could claim title, and they had the church backing them at the time, and still do. This solved a land title issue, and that is something that is still with us today. One of the liberal darlings of the Supreme Court over the last several decades has been Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now, I'm not the enemy of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but she too was part of promoting this doctrine of Christian discovery. In a case in 2005, she cited the doctrine of Christian discovery as footnote number 1 in her ruling against the Oneidas, who would purchase land in their homeland. And she cited this as one of the reasons why that was not possible, why lands could not be reclaimed. Because according to her and the doctrine of Christian discovery, which was a prevalent legal doctrine at the time, once the discovering nations of Europe stepped foot on the territory, they could claim title. our sovereignty would necessarily be diminished upon discovery. That's the claim. And there's no explanation on how that land would go from being vested in us as the original occupants of the land, but become vested in the sovereigns, because only the Europeans were considered the sovereigns at the time. But that's part of the legal doctrine. So it goes back to the church, it goes back to Christopher Columbus, and we are still battling that issue, not just in terms of land claims, but even jurisdictional issues. So the doctrine of Christian discovery is a huge problem for Native people. Now, the Catholic Church claims they no longer promote that doctrine, but they've never repudiated it. And because it's never been repudiated, and it certainly never has been overturned by the Supreme Court, like I said, not just 2005, essentially every jurisdictional case Native people face is tied to this notion that we had our sovereignty necessarily diminished upon discovery. So this is the legacy that we inherit, that you inherit essentially, from Christopher Columbus's voyages. So obviously this is the foundation for genocide, but genocide isn't just about killing people. Genocide isn't just about taking over land. The definitions of genocide include creating the conditions which a people will cease to exist. And they list, I think there's 5, if you look up the international definition of genocide, and it includes murdering people, physically, emotionally, psychologically harming people, taking children, sterilization, doing things that would cease the population to reproduce. These are among the things, and the best example of that being done to Native people is 100 years of residential schools. I'm wearing my, this isn't just my school colors, orange and black. The 30th of September has been designated both on the Canadian side and amongst many places in Native territory, Seneca territory rather, as Remembrance Day, or they're calling it Truth and Reconciliation Day, about the children some who died, but those who survived residential schools. And I argue that yes, some died, but all died some. The whole strategy that was tied to residential schools was kill the Indian, save the man. Now that phrase was coined essentially by a guy that was called Colonel or General, depending on which title he could get away with, Richard Pratt, and he ran the Carlisle Indian School. Now Richard Pratt, he cited this famed general who declared that the only good Indian was a dead Indian. And ironically, that famed general was from the Albany area, Philip Sheridan. And he said that notion that the only good Indian was a dead Indian was what led to the massacres. And that was the whole rationale behind the mass slaughter of Native people. Now, Pratt said, I agree with that, but to the extent that killing the Indian within the race was necessary to make good human beings. And that's where he comes up with this expression, kill the Indian, save the man. Now, some would argue that it doesn't literally mean kill the Indian. Well, if you look at the amount of deaths that occurred at residential schools, I think that's a hard argument to make, that death and killing actual Native children was not part of the strategy. But even if you want to subscribe to some of that, part of the issue is that they wanted to kill a part of every child that went to these schools. Now, these children didn't have a choice, by the way. On the Canadian side, there was 139 residential schools that were federally funded, more that were funded by sometimes provinces or churches by themselves. 150,000 kids, according to Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, were run through those schools. On the US side, 367 residential schools existed. And there is no real estimate, but some of the early estimates suggest that over 300,000 students were confined to these schools. Now, as we've looked at some of the deaths associated with these schools, on the Canadian side, they acknowledge that some is documented. But out of that Truth and Reconciliation Commission on the Canadian side, Canada refused to do any kind of real investigation on how many unmarked or mass graves there were. They did acknowledge over 4,000 students, kids died in those schools, but as territories have begun to do their own investigations using ground penetrating radar, that number's over 6,000. Some of the estimates suggest that there may be 15,000 children who died on the Canadian side in those residential schools. 15,000. On the US side, those numbers haven't even begun to be looked at. At Carlisle Indian School, the one that General Pratt ran, they actually had a graveyard. Now, I don't know how many of you went to a school that required a graveyard. I suspect and I hope that none of you did, but Carlisle Indian School had a graveyard. And there was over 200 kids that are buried there. Some of them, they all have markers, at least these ones. Some of them say unknown. They don't even know what the child's name is. Now, why wouldn't they know the child's name? Well, it's part of the reason is the kids had their names ripped away. They were given biblical names. So if you had my Mohawk name, my Geha name is Gardillo, but they were going to put Gardillo on a tombstone. You were Isaac, Joshua, John, Mary, Sarah. You were going to be a biblical name. You were going to be some native name. So some perhaps they didn't fully get done naming, I guess, and so they're listed as unknown. Now, a graduate of Dartmouth had done a bit of an investigation, and there's a lot of documentation, even on the U.S. and Canadian side, by the governments about assessing these schools. And this, the guy's name is Preston McBride, had done this paper, and what he determined was that the deaths far exceeded the 212 marked graves at Carlisle. In fact, without even determining how many unmarked graves there may have been associated with Carlisle, what he had uncovered was that this Colonel, General Pratt, would actually assess the health of children, and if a child looked like they were going to die, he all of a sudden the kids would be sent home so they wouldn't die on his watch. Preston McBride suggests that there may be as much as 600 or 700 children who died as a result of Carlisle Indian School. So if you do the numbers, I would argue that if there ever is a true assessment, and I'm not that confident that there ever will be, there may be 30 or 40,000 kids that will have been determined to have died at these schools. So how long do these schools last? For over 100 years. The last residential school on the US side didn't close until the 70s. We were in school in the 70s, and they were still open. On the Canadian side, 1996, the last one closed.
Wow.
Now, this didn't end with the closing of those schools, because then they still had day schools. They still had foster care. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission that the Native people of Maine had put together wasn't even regarding residential schools. It was regarding foster care and the abuse. I mean, some people would think, they think Madonna, Angelina Jolie, yes, they take these poor children and they give them a life. Well, that's not what happened with many of the Native kids. It wasn't just, it wasn't.
Or regular kids. I was in foster care since I was 4, and I didn't get adopted until I was 20.
Well, and I understand that, but my point is that Native kids were looked at as an opportunity to be picked up for forced labor, not just for abuse, but for forced labor, and that's what came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Maine. So much as this stuff continues. Now, part of what I want to address with you guys is that I would argue that the education that still exists today is still a continuation of some of that assimilation policy that was tied to these residential schools. And in case I didn't mention it, we're talking about kids who had their hair cut, their names changed, they were forbidden to speak their language. Any aspect of their life that would be somehow resemble their identity was stripped away. They were taught not only to disassociate themselves with their identity, but to loathe and to reject the Native identity. This was all part of Kill the Indian, Save the Man. Now the irony, among the ironies of this 100 years of residential schools, is that while this was happening, white schools, white kids, were picking up native mascots for their schools. Indians, warriors, braves, redskins. Nancy and I went to a school that was called, they called themselves the Cambridge Indians. So you would think, especially now, because the latest or fairly recent news cycle has demonstrated the number of unmarked graves on the Canadian side, with now a commitment from the native Interior Secretary Deb Haaland that there will be an investigation on the US side. And I'm gonna tell you, I'm not that optimistic, but I know some will. You would think with that news cycle that schools would, these non-native schools that have been using native imagery, the appropriation and the mockery of native people for their schools, you would think just information about what took place for over 100 years would be enough for these schools to say, yeah, we probably shouldn't be doing that. We probably never should have been doing that, but we certainly shouldn't continue in the future. Now, the call for social justice in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, the rise of some of the messaging coming from Black Lives Matter, has helped bring attention to this mockery and appropriation tied to native mascots, especially with sports teams, whether school, professional, or college. And we saw the Washington football team that really dug in. They were the most belligerent of the sports teams, belligerent to the extent that they didn't want to change the name. I mean, Dan Snyder, the owner of the team, said, you can put it in caps. We're never going to change it. Well, they changed it. I mean, they haven't come up with a new one yet, but they have dropped their Redskins name. The Cleveland baseball team has dropped its Indians name. And yet you still got schools digging in. You still got schools. I mean, you've got schools that call themselves savages. You know, and of course we get into a little bit of etymologies. Well, savages wasn't necessarily meant to be derogatory. Yeah, it was. I mean, no, it's a French word. It means of the woods. Yeah, but as white people were calling Native people savages, they were really trying to dehumanize us and cast us at the animal level, which I don't think is a terrible thing from a Native standpoint, but from a European standpoint, that was meant to be derogatory. Redskins is not what we called ourselves. And this notion that anybody would suggest, oh yeah, that's what Native people call themselves. No, it isn't. Just like there are some Native people who are okay with the word Indians, there are some places that will still tolerate the word redskin. But in many ways, it's like black folks who accept the word, the N-word, and have kind of taken ownership of that. It is still not something, I would not encourage anybody, any white person, to go out and spout out the N-word to anybody in public. I would also suggest that you don't want to wear blackface either. But you know what? 50,000 people can show up at a football stadium in red face and headdresses and it seems to be okay. So this is again, when you put things into a perspective, and I hate to compare the racism that Native people experience to the racism that black people and other people of color experience. But there is a common element there. Sorry, but it's white folks. so you know, the question that people have to ask themselves is, am I just going to claim that I'm not racist, or am I going to be an example of somebody who's anti-racist? And that's what I'm hoping that people who do audiovisual production, people who write, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, that even if you don't share my perspective, that you can acknowledge that my perspective exists and understand that the perspective exists and why it exists. Look, it is hard to look at somebody and make an evaluation or a judgment on their lives if you don't know the backstory, if you don't know the whole story. And that's what happens too often in the world that we live in. right? We cast these judgments based on how a person, the visualization of a person has been cast to us by media, social media, Hollywood. Hollywood has defined Native people. Most of these mascots that schools use, for many, many years, was always the Plains Indian headdress. Didn't matter if it was East Coast, didn't matter if it was West Coast, didn't matter if it was Southwest. It was always the same image. Why? Because that's what Hollywood created as our identity. We didn't get to choose our own identity. We not only couldn't even choose the words we called ourselves. Ongwe, Ganyagahaga. We got stuck with Mohawk and Indians. So we reject some of that, but we also reject the imagery and the appropriation of that imagery. You know, the Florida State Seminoles, and I call them that because that's what they call themselves, they actually ride out a guy, calls himself Chief Osceola, on a horse, and throws a spear as he rides out on the football field. The Seminoles did not ride horses. It was a swamp. It's the Everglades. But that's what they do. And so we're supposed to sit and just say, oh, no, that's fine that you can misrepresent who we are. You can misrepresent our images. And what happens is you're teaching children, little kids from kindergarten up through 12th grade, you're teaching them that is what an Indian is, a Redskin is, what a Seminole is, what a Mohawk is. Not this. We are a living people. And we have a history that we do know in spite of what you've been taught. I mean, I once spoke to a crowd at Union College down in Schenectady, I think. And I talked to the students, I said, look, I know a lot about you. I know what you eat, I know the movies that you watch, and the music you listen to. But the first time I tell you that I'm Native, and I was literally, and this is 20 years ago, I still have people asking, well, do you live in teepees? You know, where do you get your food? I get the food the same place you do at the grocery store. You grow food too, but see, the whole thing is questions come into your mind because you have been improperly educated about what Native people are. Look, when they teach history or teach about Native people, and when we were in school, remember they used to do these memorization things, and I can't remember the whole, but it was idiots do collect rusty nails. Remember that?
Yeah.
And idiots represented Indians. Do was discovery, collect was colonization, rusty was revolution. That's how you remember the historical eras. So we were the idiots. We were the first history of a period of American history that ended with discovery. No, we weren't. We're still here. And we still reject, look, I don't claim to be a U.S. citizen. I reject the imposition of U.S. citizenship. Now, I don't hate Americans, I don't hate Canadians, but you passed a law in 1924 that declared, not you, but the country did, passed a law in 1924 that declared Native people were hereby American citizens. Wait a minute, I don't get a choice in this? You know, in the international community, 10 years before that, they were calling that a war crime. They called it denationalization. That was before the word genocide was invented. This idea of stripping away somebody's national character and imposing another national character upon them, that was considered a war crime. It still is today. But not as it relates to Native people. We are still going through forced assimilation. With every Pocahontas story they teach in school, with every Christopher Columbus myth, even when, I mean, there was a great series called Exterminate All the Brutes by Raoul Peck. I don't know if you get a chance to check that out. I think it was on HBO Max, you can find it anyway. He did a great job with it, and Raoul Peck is an extraordinary filmmaker. But at one point, and it's a 5-part series, I think, at one point he was talking about the fact that we still exist, and talking about our achievement. But when he started listing the fact that we still exist and what we've achieved, what he lists Joy Harjo. Joy Harjo was the, what do they call it? The
Poet laureate.
Poet laureate, yeah. Listed a couple of Native women who were elected into Congress, including Deb Haaland, who is now the Interior Secretary. So the very people that he put up on the screen were all people who have achieved success within an assimilated system. Now, I don't begrudge Joy Harjo by any means. But I'm not sure that she's even considered the premier poet. You know, when I understand some of the poetry that's coming out of the activist community, it makes some of Joy's stuff seem pretty tepid. Now, and again, I'm not criticizing Joy. I think she's done some great work. But if you're only going to say that these are the successful Native people, the Jim Thorpes because he got gold medals for the United States, the Billy Mills because he got a gold medal for the United States, those people who've achieved success in a standard judged by American society. Mary Simon, the Governor General of Canada, the agent of the Queen, a Native person. But that's not the people that I consider the premier models or role models for Native people. Look, I've got friends who are right now in Minnesota fighting Line 3, a pipeline that could possibly destroy all the wild rice waters of Minnesota. I've got friends who were not just arrested, but who protested the Dakota Access Pipeline, the Keystone XL Pipeline, pipelines in New York City and across the southern part of New York. I've got friends who have stood up. No, I didn't enlist in the U.S. military at the highest rate of any other group of people in the United States, like many Native people do. But don't just tell me about the code talkers. Talk to me about the people who rejected the U.S. military, who stand up to police abuse. Because frankly, those are my heroes. And I know that's not the way Native people are going to be taught in school. But that's who exists. If you go into a Native territory, you're going to find people who are still resistant to assimilation. We still, not everybody, we still reject the imposition of Canadian or U.S. citizenship. Not everybody. And in doing so, we aren't necessarily trying to criticize Canadians or Americans. We're just saying, you can't make us that. If we want to, if we choose to, that's one thing. But you can't declare it with the Citizenship Act of 1924 or the Indian Act on the Canadian side. How close are we getting?
We're at 122.
122?
Yeah, I think I said 12:30 before.
Okay, all right.
I'm at 1:30.
Okay, all right, good. I'm just making sure that we still have time. So I think this is what's important, is that people understand that Native people are not a monolith. There are Native people who, frankly, there are Native people who are okay with Native mascots. And to me, that seems kind of absurd, but I understand it. I'm old enough that when I was a kid, there was so very little in the dominant culture around us that I knew a lot of Native kids who rooted for the Washington football team, that wanted a Chicago Blackhawks jersey or a Cleveland Indians hat. Why? Because there was nothing else in the dominant culture that we could identify with. But that generation finally gave way, in large part, to understanding the mockery and the appropriation. The Florida State Seminole guy. The idea of people tumbling across a football field or cheerleaders at a basketball game, mocking Native dance and culture and song. We began to view that through a different lens and realized, wait a second, all these white people are calling themselves, they're playing Indian. While our own kids died in residential schools because of that very identity. So you got publicly financed schools promoting the appropriation of Native identity, while you also had public finance eliminating it, prohibiting it, stomping it out, killing the Indian, save the man. I mean, we're at a time now, look, the mascot issue is an issue that I feel strongly about. Part of the reason I feel strongly about it is because we're winning this one. We don't stop a whole lot of pipelines. We do, but we don't stop a whole lot of them. We're not winning the war on many of the Native issues that we're fighting for. But mascots we are. And I suspect, I mean, the school that we went to school at Cambridge, in June, they voted to retire the mascot. In July, they voted to bring it back. Now, some families there had petitioned the New York State Department of Education to argue that that resolution to bring the mascot back was arbitrary and capricious and was causing harm to students. And the commissioner agreed, or at least agreed to the extent that she granted a stay prohibiting them from reinstating the mascot. We don't know where this is going to go. I suspect that the fact that she issued the stay is a pretty good indication that she's going to rule that they can't bring it back. And I'm hoping that this commissioner, knowing that there are laws on the books already, like the Dignity for All Students Act, laws, anti-discrimination law, anti-racist laws. There's already enough laws without another law being passed that specifically prohibits Native mascots. There's enough law already that she, as the Commissioner of Education, could call for the banishment, or the banning, I guess I should say, of Native mascots. Now here's one thing, and I've got to address this too. If you are being taught from an early age to fetishize Native people in the way that these mascot images do, you're also fetishizing Native women. Native women experience rape and sexual assault at the highest rate of anybody else in the United States and Canada. We have a problem that we call missing and murdered Indigenous women. It also includes girls, transgender, two-spirit. In fact, today, on the Canadian side and on many Native territories, they're designating this day, October 4th, as MMIW Awareness Day. Part of what contributes to this essentially wholesale sexual assault on Native women goes back to Columbus. It's actually tied. See, the thing is, as I talk about this stuff, there's so much that's connected. The extractive industries. Many of these extractive industries, they create man camps in these very remote areas where the only women in the area are Native women. Highway 16 is considered the highway of terror or the highway of tears. It's a place where women turn up missing at the highest rate any place on the Canadian side. So there's a connection between how you have been educated about who and what Native people are, including who and what Native women are, and how Native women and how Native people are treated. I once said, the only thing more racist than a whole school of white people appropriating Native imagery for the mascot is the response you get when you tell them it's wrong. It's been amazing, the vitriol that I have received, and those that have supported this effort in Cambridge. It's amazing what some of these people have had to go through. Why? Because people are assholes. I mean, it's just amazing how hateful Native or people can get when they feel like you're taking something from them. I mean, they've taken such ownership of words like Indians and Redskin and Savages and Braves and Warriors and all that stuff, that if they have to surrender that because of social influences, I mean, they feel like they're being robbed of something. Like we, Native people, are stealing something from white people. So to suggest that it's absurd is an understatement. I'll stop there because I would, one of my favorite parts about addressing a live audience is a chance to interact, and I very much like to do that. So I'll stop there with what I've had to say. Trust me, I can go on for hours, and you'll hate me at the end of it. So we'll stop there while I might still have some of you along with me. So thank you for listening and being attentive. I appreciate it. I will say one thing. I know some of you are writers, or plan to be, and we really could use help telling our story. Obviously, us telling our story is important, but how the media, how writers, how storytellers tell that story is really important. And I think, look, we don't have that. We don't have that kind of background. We don't have the educational background necessarily to write a 400-page novel. But some of you may. But I tell you, if you ever want to tell some compelling stories, reach out. I've got a few that I'm working on. Reach out, because we would love to collaborate with not just native writers, but non-native writers as well. And that includes, everything from, documentary work. Like I said, Raoul Peck's work on Exterminating All the Brutes was great. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who is not native, although she's got some native connections in her life, she's written some incredible books. In fact, her latest one is called Not a Nation of Immigrants. She challenges some of that narrative, but she's written in the Howard Zinn style, an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, and a few other really, really good books. So we need people who are willing to not just investigate. And part of what I'm hoping to do is help give you some of the questions to ask. Not give you the answers, but give you the questions. Now I'll take some of yours.
Good segue.
Go ahead.
This is a basic question, but what made you decide to become an activist?
Well, part of it is it's just a life. I am Native, so I was obviously very aware of Native issues. I married a Native woman. I live on Native territory, so you live this life. See, many of these issues that I talk about are not just two-dimensional issues. These are issues that we face. We live with this stuff. So confronting it, and part of it, I'll admit, some of the first things that I was fighting against was specifically against government, fighting New York State, fighting the federal government. But then you realize that the monster is much bigger than that, because you're fighting what Hollywood did to us. You're fighting what mascots do to us. You're fighting what writers have done. One of the guys, L. Frank Baum. Does anybody remember who L. Frank Baum is? He wrote The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. He was also the editor of a newspaper called the Saturday Pioneer in Aberdeen, Dakota Territory. Wasn't a state then. On December 20th, let's see, it would have been 1892. He wrote an editorial where he lamented the death, which was really the murder of Sitting Bull. And he also subscribed to the notion that the only good Indian was dead Indian. Not necessarily in the same way that, say, Pratt did, but what he said was that all the good Indians were dead, now, especially now that Sitting Bull was dead. And so what he said was that in the interest of security for the frontier, really the best thing that the United States could do is exterminate all the remaining Native people. Exterminate us. And he said, why not annihilation? Their glory is fled, their manhood has been effaced. Better that we die than live the miserable wretches that we are. In later ages, people would lift us up as the grand kings of the forest and plain. Talk about us in the way that James Fenimore Cooper wrote of us. Create us as a noble race. In fact, they call their football teams, name their football teams after us. L. Frank Baum predicted what would happen to Native people when white people could take ownership of our identity. But the only problem with that is that if we still exist, we screw up that whole narrative. That's why he called for our extermination. Now, a small paper in Aberdeen, Dakota Territory may not seem that significant, but within 2 weeks, the massacre at Wounded Knee took place. Right within that area. So, what you write matters. I'll take the next question. Anybody else? Go ahead.
So you were talking about names and terms of reference. So when we use the term Native in the Americas, we're talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of different disparate cultures that were falling under that umbrella. So how do you navigate the individual cultural identities like Mohawk, Oneida, Seneca, while having to at least pragmatically live under that Native moniker when you're communicating with the dominant culture at large?
Well, our word for what people would call Native people is Ongwe, and it just means the original people, essentially the original people of the land. Now, I understand that there are very, very different cultures across all of that. And those cultures vary from everything related to governance structures, spirituality, obviously language, appearance, all that stuff. But we understand that we have a relationship. And it's amazing when I travel to another native territory, how much sometimes even the words line up. And it gives an indication, just how extensive trade routes must have been prior to European contact and that kind of stuff. So, no, I fully acknowledge that there are native people, and I always call the Canadian border the imaginary line because it's not really there. But we get confronted by that, but I still acknowledge. I mean, I'm Gunyagahaga, I'm Mohawk, and there are probably more Mohawk people on the other side of that imaginary line than on this side. And that's the other thing that happens is the federal governments of Canada and the United States, they separate us. They even label us differently. So the only quote unquote federally recognized tribe of Mohawks is the St. Regis Mohawk tribe. I'm not a St. Regis Mohawk. In fact, most of the people I know who live in Akwesasne would never call themselves that. So the language and the words that get, I mean, how do we come up with words like lac de flambeau? That's not a native word. Seneca was a Roman orator. I mean, the word for Seneca, they call themselves, is Onondaga, the people of the big hills. I'm Gunyagahaga, the people of the land of Flint. My wife is Onyotaaga, the people of where the stones stand. Kuyugaaga, the people of the swamps or the marshlands. These are the words that we use because we connect ourselves to the lands that we live on or that we originate from. So no, the language is a big part of it. But if you go to the Dene, if you ask what that translates to, it always comes back to the people. Anishinaabe, the people. Lakota, the people of something. They may have some other characteristics tied to it. Land characteristics. People where the sun rises on the east coast. People where the sun sets on the west coast. So that's part of how we how we describe ourselves. So I don't know if that answers your question. Anybody else? Yeah, go ahead.
Regarding writers, and particularly writers of fiction, I think that, there's a sort of a big cultural conversation about representation right now in media. And I think that a lot of white writers struggle with wanting to represent Native peoples and Native cultures, but feeling A, that that's like not my story to tell, and B, not wanting to like misrepresent or not, as you said before, not even knowing the right questions to ask or knowing like where to go. So do you have any sort of general advice for white writers who want to have diverse?
You got to get to know some Native people. One of the good books that I encourage you to read is called Killers of the Flower Moon. It's by David Grand, who writes for the New Yorker, and it's the story of the murder of the Osage. The Osage in the beginning of the 1900s, they were the wealthiest people on the planet because oil was discovered under their land and oil was becoming a valuable commodity. And they were being murdered to the extent that white men were seducing Native women, having children with them, killing their wives, and then taking over the head rights to the oil wells. And it was being done by the hundreds, if not thousands. David Grand did the research by going to the Osage, meeting with those people, reading the history, and then telling the story. Now, if you read the book, it's really important to read the end of the book because although the story talks about the prosecution of a few individuals who were convicted of murder that essentially got out of jail, he tells the story of those that were not pursued. And there's a good chance that book will become a movie. And I hope the movie doesn't end with the conviction of 2 or 3 people because it was such a pervasive practice that everybody from the grocer, the general store, the coroner, the doctor, the dentist, everybody was involved in this conspiracy to essentially take from the Osage. So that's an example. But you have to talk to somebody. You have to, there's a neither wolf nor dog nor wolf or something. There's a book, a movie or something like that. And it's the struggle of a white writer who's being asked by a Native person to tell the story. And so I think it's neither dog nor wolf or something like that. It's a challenge. And that's why if you're going to write, I would suggest not just, I would suggest a collaboration, not just going at this thing unilaterally. Anybody else? Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to know about your take on, there's a number of, as I'm sure you're aware of, schools that are religiously sponsored but are promoted as, serving the native populations. And when you see their reach out for contributions, they portray that they are honoring the native cultures with their students and whatnot, but they're religiously sponsored schools. I don't know, St. Joseph's, maybe one like that. I'm just curious of your take on those type of schools that seem like they're fairly numerous in the West.
Well, you have to remember that every one of the residential schools, they were government funded, but they were church run.
Yeah.
The Catholic Church ran more than half of them. So the abuse that took place at these schools included rape, murder, a full range of sexual abuse, but also malnourishment, physical abuse, mental abuse. There was, kids died because of the lack of health care. And it isn't just because medicine wasn't advanced. I read a story recently that said after 1950, the death rate dropped off on the Canadian side because of antibiotics. Well, the lack of antibiotics wasn't the only problem. So the churches hiding behind their religion does not get them off the hook. It never did, and even today, part of the issue that Native people face is this, again, this indoctrination, and that's part of what schools do, not just with history, but if you're talking about religious schools, then clearly you're talking about spirituality as well. I mean, look, Native culture has been condemned as pagan worship, not just by governments, but by the churches as well. So I'm not a big fan of, if you want to help people, then you should reach out to the communities and not necessarily to non-Native institutions that claim to be helping us.
But you're not aware of the type of schools I'm referring to?
Excuse me?
You're not aware of the type of schools I'm referring to?
I know. They
Okay.
send you plastic things that like napkin holders and stuff like that, and stuff to hang on your wall, and they usually have some sort of Native twisting of some sort of story, that has some sort of biblical reference to it, like walking in somebody else's moccasins or something like that.
You're not seriously showing the same abuse as the native schools?
Yeah, I don't know. The physical abuse is as prevalent today as it was, but certainly if you're talking about eliminating somebody else's culture by displacing that culture, that's still, that's still a problem. So I'm not a fan personally, but I have never visited, these schools out west.
Because they portray as providing cultural background for their students, so I'm just wondering if you, whether you feel that's completely bogus and it's part of their advertisement for contributions.
Well, it's kind of like language. Everybody wants to promote and idealize Native code talkers, but understand that the United States was trying to kill our language. And once they could weaponize it and use it for the military, all of a sudden they said our language had value. Now there's a lot of talk about doing language programs, but we even get into a fight over who owns the teaching mechanisms for teaching our language. Not just with Microsoft or somebody else, but with the governments who are involved in trying to promote this thing. So I'm always a little apprehensive. I mean, I would rather deal with Native organizations than non-Native organizations if I'm trying to help Native people. That's my preference. Anybody else?
We have time for one more question, if anybody's got one.
Don't be scared, come on.
Well,
Go ahead.
I'm wondering how can we do better? So I know that, supporting the area schools, the name change for the area schools, I think is really important. But what else can we do as northern New York communities, which do not have a large population of Native, at least in our counties here? What can we do to help? Because I honestly feel very helpless most of the time.
Well, the internet is an incredible thing, and there's a lot of information available. Part of it is just to become more informed, and the mascot issue is one of them. But there's any number of things that you can research now in terms of where Native people fit into the environmental movement, how you can help different people in that regard. Learn about missing and murdered Indigenous women. Learn about residential schools. And, you know, again, I'm not a fan of Native people running for office. I'm going to flat out say it. That's not my thing. I don't vote in American elections. But you folks do and should. But you also can call upon your elected officials to be responsible. And, I mean, there are states that have passed prohibitions against Native mascots. And New York has a bill that's been floating around, whether it ever gets passed or not. But that's a small thing. But part of the idea is, can you embrace a disposition of not just being not racist, but being anti-racist? And try to be a little bit more aware of what you see and what you witness. Because you're gonna find out, if you look, you're gonna find that there's a lot of stuff that just is not quite right. And, you know, and you know, make a mental note and then research some of it. The problem is that history is taught in such a way that there is more that is excluded than is misrepresented. I think one of the places to start, if you do get involved in teaching, is to stop the false narrative. Stop telling the Pocahontas story and the Happy Little Pilgrims and Happy Little Indian story. Stop doing that. But then teach a little bit more. I mean, does anybody know? Has anybody ever heard of Mankato, Minnesota? In Mankato, Minnesota, in 1862, December 26th, 38 Dakota were hung. A massive gallows, 38 hung, all at one time, knocked the lever off, 38 men died. The execution order was signed by Abraham Lincoln. Day after Christmas, all the fine people of Mankato, Minnesota came out to watch a hanging. Abraham Lincoln signed the execution order. The day after Christmas, 1862, is a week before the Emancipation Proclamation becomes law, essentially. If you're going to tell the Emancipation Proclamation story, but not tell the Mankato, Minnesota story, and why were they hung? Were they all just fine, upstanding citizens? No, they were people who were fighting. They were fighting because Abraham Lincoln, in the beginning of that year, signed the Homestead Act that allowed white people to take native lands. And the native people didn't get paid for it. In many of the cases where native people were dispossessed of land, it would take years before there would be compensation, if any compensation came. And then what the compensation was another issue. So those native people were fighting against, you know, and everybody wants to think of, what was it, Michael Landon and the Little House on the Prairie and the little girls there. No, that's not what was out there on the frontier. There were people who, for one thing, there were laws that were passed that allowed people to kill native people and still turn in our scalps for bounties. I mean, right through, you know, much of the settlement of the West. I mean, when you talk about the gold rush and all that other stuff, native people were being cleared out. We were being murdered. This expression, you ever hear the news talk about somebody, they use the expression, well, such and such really went off the reservation on this one. You ever hear that expression? You know what that refers to? If you go off reservation, you are considered a hostile. It was legal to kill a native person if they were off the reservation. Reservations were like concentration camps. So when they use it politically, and I remember hearing one of the ones that sticks out is when they referred to Bill Clinton, who was not necessarily giving the Hillary Clinton narrative when she was campaigning, and they said, well, Bill went off the reservation on that one. It's like, doesn't anybody realize that's a racist thing for somebody to say? I mean, you wouldn't exactly say, well, you really left the plantation on that one, didn't he? See, and again, I hate to always make the comparison, but there are some things that we can accept as being improper today when it comes to, you know, some cultures. But native people, we experience, I'm not saying the worst, but we experience a unique level of racism. And part of it has to do with the idea that we are essentially treated as if we no longer exist. So we don't have the voice to stand up. But we do. And I'm hoping some of you will help. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it.